Okay, thanks so much, Pippa. And thanks a lot for sticking around to the very end. Today, I'm going to be talking about Pictish symbols, but particularly focusing on the sociolinguistic niche that they had in the ecology of writing systems present at the time. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Pictish symbols as a likely writing system. I'm going to survey some of what I'm claiming is the contrastive variation between the basic shapes in the system. And then I'm going to ask the question, can we determine comparatively, looking across writing systems, how the Pictish symbol writing system might have worked on the basis of this comparison? I'm going to try and scoot through that because I know some of you have already seen a more elaborated version of that argument. Then I'm going to jump into the deep dive on visually engaging with the three contemporaneous scripts, so Ogham, Latin, and the Pictish scripts. And by looking at the visual properties of each script, I'm going to try and answer the question, can we determine comparatively, comparing the three scripts, the sociolinguistic niche and the original media of use for each of the scripts? To cut a long story short, I'm going to claim that the sociolinguistic niche of Pictish symbols is inherently ornamental, although throughout the conference I've been thinking maybe aesthetic might be a better way to describe it because it seems less optional. And I'm going to be revisiting some theories from the mid-20th century that the original medium of use for Pictish symbols were as tattoos. Okay, so to begin, who were the Picts? The Picts were a late antique, early medieval people of northern Britain. The distribution map here you can see is of the Pictish symbol inscribed objects. So in eastern and northern modern day Scotland, for the large part. The time period that we'll be talking about is roughly between the 4th and 9th centuries. This is a highly, highly problematic timeline that gives you a rough estimate of when we imagine the Pictish symbol system might have been invented in the 4th century, potentially, maybe a bit earlier in the 3rd century. All of these are common era dates. We get this first type of monument that really flourished around the 6th century after the Roman withdrawal. And then much later in the 8th, 9th century, we start to see relief carved monuments that also have Pictish symbols and, as you can see, overt Christian iconography. The language varieties that were around at the time, in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, we're really talking about an early Proto-British variety. In the 5th and 6th centuries, some people refer to Britannic being a kind of variety of late Proto-British that's minimally differentiated, and that eventually results in the Pictish language between the 7th and 9th centuries. So some major sound changes occurred in the 5th and 6th centuries that kind of that differentiate the earlier varieties and what we call the Neo-Celtic languages. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about the fact that if we imagine the invention of the symbol system was in the 4th, 3rd century, it would have had to straddle this major grammatical, typological interval, just as we know is the case for the Ogham writing system. So the Pictish symbol system itself exhibits a high degree of regularity over a large geographical and chronological area. Mostly we find Pictish symbols inscribed in monumental contexts. So on the far left, you can see an incised symbol stone. In the middle, you can see the reverse of a Pictish cross slab. And while you get a lot of Christian iconography on the obverse of these monuments, on the reverse, you tend to get the Pictish symbols and kind of secular scenes. This one is potentially representing a battle. But outside of these monumental contexts, we also see living rock. So caves, cliff faces, rock panels, although none as big as we just saw. And we also see portable objects. So here we have an incised bone object, and we also have a small incised stone disc. In terms of the function, there's been a lot of claims about what they were for. So some people have said that they indicate social status, tribal affiliation, marriage alliances. In the 90s and onwards, people have started to claim that Pictish symbols are a narrowly defined writing system. This is the hypothesis that I don't really have a lot of time to justify today, but I've got a wee extra slide at the end if you're interested. Okay, so Today, I classify Pictish symbols, the basic shapes of Pictish symbols, in terms of three kind of macro categories: geometric, zoomorphic, and artifactual. So shapes, animals, and objects. Today, I'm going to be talking mostly about the shapes and the animals that don't really look like animals. They kind of look like mythological beasties. There's a lot to be said about the real animals and the objects, but not today. We're just looking at the abstract ones. Okay, so how do you build an abstract basic shape? Well, I argue that what you do is you start with one of three elementary forms: a circle, a rectangle, or an arch. That gives you three basic shapes. To get three more, we double them. So we get the double disc, the divided rectangle, and the serpent. To get three more, you triple the elementary form. You have the triple disc, the tuning fork, and the long serpent. To get three more, you take the original elementary form and you roughly halve it. So you get the crescent, the L shape, and the single flower. So you'll have seen with the serpent and the long serpent that they seem to have grown a tail and a head. So I'm going to argue that schematically this is representative of the double horseshoe, but they've undergone what I call zoomorphization. And I think the same process is at play allographically for the L shape as well. And to get our final three, what we do is we take that half, we copy it, rotate it round, and glom it onto itself, and you get what I've called the reflex degree. And I think a bit of zoomorphization is also optional for the S shape. And this is actually how you get all of the abstract graphing. So I think it's really quite interesting that you can generate them via these regular transformations. But that's not enough. Okay, we need more. So to get some more, we take those original elementary forms, the original basic shapes, and we modify the edge somehow. So we either take a notch out of it, or we add a bulb to it, or we add kind of what we call a pelter to it. Not all of the basic shapes take this transformation, but you can see the majority do. This gives us another series of 13 basic shapes, but that's not enough. To get even more, what we do is we add a rod modifier. So a rod modifier sometimes looks like a V, sometimes looks like a backwards Z, sometimes looks like an I. And as you can see, not all of the basic shapes take this modification either. And I think that three of them take the modification, but only exist in that zoomorphized form. I'm happy to argue about this later. Okay, so if we take that as red, what we have is we have this kind of graphetic paradigm of 15 plain basic shapes, and then another column of rod modified basic shapes, and another column of edge modified basic shapes. This is where kind of the comparative graphematic approach comes in. So, thumbing through your copy of Daniels and Bright, you're looking for writing systems that share this type of paradigm, and I'm sure some of you are already thinking there are writing systems out there that look like this. If we hop over to the Philippines, oh no. You'll have to imagine these beautiful Alpha Slavic abugidas that exhibit in the first column a plain, unmodified basic shape. In the second column, that basic shape with a regular modification. So in all of these cases, a kind of a mark kind of towards the upper side of the basic shape. And then the third column has a mark at the bottom of the basic shape. So essentially, we have this system that graphematically represents open syllables. The 15 basic, the 15 basic plain basic shapes represent a consonant and an inherent vowel. And then the modifications representing a change in the quality of that vowel. So is it possible we've got the same thing for Pictish symbols? If so, we'd be looking for a 15-way consonant distinction. I think a really apt comparison at this point is with the Ogham script, which we know because of biscriptals was present at the time. And if we look at the way that the Ogham consonants of the core inventory work, they're formed by one of three elementary forms, transformed in one of five regular ways. So they form these families of basic shapes. And more than that, three of the transformations are exactly the same. So a single, double, and triple instance of the elementary form. Okay, so what we've seen is, I'm there for scale. What we've seen is that we've seen this hypothesis that picture symbols worked as an Alpha Slavic abugida, and that they were designed the same way as the Ogham script. But I think you'll agree that Ogham and Pictish symbols have very different visual appearances. And in fact, we know that Latin was around. We know that Ogham was about. Why do we need Pictish symbols at all? And I think this monumental complex is really interesting because it shows you that in this kind of 6th, maybe 7th century context, we have all three scripts and they're all importing their own kind of archetypal layout. So we've got Ogham, a single line at the periphery of a surface, although this is a little bit odd because it kind of goes top down and it curves up at the bottom. We've got an alphabetic script here that's almost certainly derived from a Latin script. And then we have Pictish symbols, which is a short inscription, but it's very large, filling all of the available width of the surface. Okay, so what I'm going to argue from here on in is that they occupy different sociolinguistic niches. That the Latin script was occupying an intellectual niche. So not just for inscribing personal names, but for inscribing abstract concepts, complex propositions, long extended inscriptions. And we know the original medium of use in Northern Britain in the case of the Latin script. For the Ogham script, one of my supervisors, Professor Catherine Forsyth, has argued that it's more of a kind of practical script. So all you need is a stick and a knife, and you can prepare an Ogham inscription. You don't need fancy instruments. You don't need a fancy writing surface. Everyone has access to a stick and a knife. What I'm going to argue for Pictish symbols is that there's an inherently aesthetic, inherently ornamental motivation for their use, and that the original medium was tattooing. So to kind of back this up to the extent that you believe me, I'm going to ask a few questions. So are basic shapes made up of outlines that are straight or curved? Are they open or closed? Do basic shapes allow for or indeed encourage ornamentation? Does the direction of interpretation affect the grapheme identification, which kind of is important if you're a tattooing script, because a tattoo is going to be viewed from all different types of directions? Can a single inscription fill and conform to irregularities on a surface? If you think of Latin and Ogham and Pictish symbols, they do that all very differently. And then do portables that are inscribed with these scripts fall from specific domains of use, which might give us an idea of the sociolinguistic niche. But first, is there any historical evidence for Pictish symbols as tattoos? Kind of. There's certainly historical evidence for Pictish tattoos, and if you squint, you kind of can see that they might be referring to the symbol system itself. So in the 3rd century, Solinus wrote of Northern Britain, for the most part, the region is held by barbarians, that's the Picts. Even from childhood, they are marked by local artists with various figures and images of animals. So that should be kind of triggering alarm bells for you. Around the same time, we have Herodian writing of the Picts. They also tattoo their bodies with various patterns and pictures of all sorts of animals. Again, alarm bells, hence the reason why they do not wear clothes, so as not to cover the pictures on their bodies. So we know at least why they were naked. And we have a few more accounts that are all consistent with this idea that the Pictish symbols might be writing, that they consist of various shapes and animals, attributing a memorial or beautifying or even naming function, and that they're associated with a kind of nobility, potentially. This then led Francis Dyack in the 40s to claim that Pictish symbols are simply the tattoo design belonging to each individual and varying according to what he was repeated on his stone. He noticed that Herodian, as we saw, divides the tattoo figures into 2 classes, drawings of various kinds and representations of animals. But this is just the classification into which our symbols fall. I agree. In the 60s, Charles Thomas claimed something similar, that in the late 5th and 6th centuries, the tattoo designs were taken over into the new medium of inscribed pillar stones and used to convey much the same kind of information. And he went further to say that this is the only hypothesis that explains the stylization, the wide public currency pre-monumentally of the symbol system, the necessary simplicity of the system, and also their context in portable and Cape art context. Sorry. Okay, so the first question I want to ask in terms of the visuality of the three scripts, are basic shapes straight or curved? So if we take the old Roman cursive script, which might have been a little bit earlier than the period we're interested in, but certainly was present in Northern Britain. On the left, you can see those basic shapes formed just of straight lines. On the right, those which are formed just of curved lines. And in the middle, you can see that the majority of old Roman cursive basic shapes are a mix of both straight and curved lines. If we contrast this with Ogham, you can see that they're all straight lines, which again is consistent with this proposed medium of use. If we look at Pictish symbols, though, you can see that the majority are either curved or a mixture of curved and straight lines. So immediately we can say, okay, originally Pictish symbols were not carved on wood the same way that Ogham was. So that's already kind of getting our juices flowing, saying that these are potentially in different media of use. Are basic shapes open or closed? So you can see Old Roman cursive, the majority of basic shapes are open, and we've only got the one lonely O that's a fully closed basic shape. If we revisit Ogham, they're all open. So up one end of the spectrum. And then if we look at Pictish symbols, they're all up the other end of the spectrum. Almost all of them are closed. And those that are semi-open in a regular way. So they're essentially closed shapes that are being modified by a linear modifier. Now, this has a real kind of corollary in terms of how they appear in real life. So this is every instance in the corpus of the what we call the horseshoe symbol, and the horseshoe with a wee bulb, and the horseshoe with a V rod. And what you can see for the first, at first glance, is that on the right we have those graphs that exhibit ornamentation, and every example of the ornamented horseshoe has a different ornamentation. On the left, we can see those graphs that don't bear ornamentation, and on the far left, you see a dark gray column. These are all of the graphs that are in cave wall contexts. Next to that column, you can see a light gray column. These are all the portable horseshoe symbols. So what you start to get a picture of is that the ornamentation is really more a feature of the monumental context than it is an inherent meaning-bearing unit of the writing system. So this ornamentation doesn't come for free. So again, this is for scale. You can see the symbol stone at Abernethy, which has unfortunately been cut down a significant amount. But every internal area of these, the two main symbols, the big ones, is full of this, beautiful curving, spiraling ornament. And you can see it's really, really deep. There's a thought that I've had that I haven't kind of got all the way through to the very end so we saw yesterday some stone carving. In the 6th century, this monument type, the type of carving is not in the most part chiseling, but it's something pocking and smoothing. So in order to create this incision line, it's likely that there have been pocks created, and then there's been smoothing between them. And I think there's potentially something to think about in terms of traditional tattooing practices and pocking and smoothing as a method. But I haven't thought that through to the end. But yeah, so it's resource intensive. This is not something obligatory. So there's something to be said about how much time, effort, and skill is being put into creating the internal ornamentation. This is doubled when we get to the relief carved monumental time. So I've tried my hand at this myself, and even under the expert tutelage of heritage stone carver David McGovern, this took me and my fellow PhD student who's also looking at symbol stones, Heather Ford, at the University of Glasgow. This took us, over 3 hours to create this limestone version of an original granite stone. And it's not great. Like it's not bad for our first day, but there was significant help from David. But yeah, so really resource intensive, highly skilled, and it's not for free. Okay, so the next question that's really important is, does the direction of interpretation determine the grapheme identification? And this really splits the scripts apart. So we have these basic shapes. If we rotate or reflect these basic shapes, we get other basic shapes that belong to different graphemes. So if we flip a B, it's an H. If we flip an L, it's a D. I would argue that if we take the serpent Z-rod here of the Pictish symbol system, we can rotate the serpent, we can rotate the Z-rod, we could rotate both. I don't think this is contrastively, I don't think this is a contrastive type of variation in the symbol system, and I would argue that these all relate to the one graphematic unit. This is really important in terms of the direction of interpretation, because if you interpret an Ulm inscription in one direction, and you interpret the same inscription in another direction, not only do you get the wrong order of graphemes, you also misidentify some of the graphemes because of the direction of interpretation. This contrasts with the Pictish symbol system. I've reasons for believing that all three of these stones relate to the same linguistic content. I can talk about that later. But what you'll note is that I think that the direction of interpretation of these two are the default downwards interpretation, and this one is upwards. So if they're to relate to the same linguistic content, for the one that's interpreted upwards, we haven't had to rotate that upwards to get the same reading, or like reflect the crescent so that the points are upwards. The same grapheme is being identified with a different direction of interpretation, which I would argue is consistent with the proposed medium of original use. In terms of an inscription filling and conforming to an irregular surface, Pictish symbols are really, really good at doing this. So you can see a couple of undressed pillar stones here, and the Pictish symbols have been expanded, rotated, reflected, arranged in really odd ways, all to kind of fill up the maximal potential of that surface. Try as it might, if you look at the next two pillars, Ulm just can't do this. So whether it's using the arris or the edge of a stone as a stem line and creating notches either side of that, or whether the stem line has been drawn in and the Ulm's straight up a surface of a stone, it just really can't fill the surface. Also, Pictish symbols are particularly good at conforming to irregularities in a writing surface. So here we have a pre-existing substantial fracture in this undressed stone. And the Pictish symbols have just been rotated, they've been arranged slightly differently, just to kind of fit around that. We even have a much later relief carved object that has an engineered groove in it. And so the Pictish symbols have been designed and planned at the same time as this groove and have been fitted around the groove. A final question about the domains of use of particular portables. If we look at Ulm to begin with, we see that several, but obviously not all, Ulm portables do seem to occur on do seem to be more practical tools. So over there we've got a weaver's weft beater inscribed with Ulm. We've got a knife handle, a leatherworking tool, a spindle whirl, all kind of a bit more practical than you might expect the Pictish symbols to be born on. So the Pictish symbol portables tend to be a bit more ornamental, and several of them have overt associations with the body. So we've got a crossbow brooch made of silver there that's inscribed with a Pictish symbol. These beautiful silver chain termini that have Pictish symbols inscribed. A bone pin, a shale pendant that on the reverse seems to have what looks like a Pictish symbol on it. And then we have these metal objects with potential analogs in kind of votive plaques. Gaming seems to be a context where we do get overlap of both Ogham and Pictish symbols. Okay, so essentially, of all of these questions that I've asked to kind of get at the core of the medium, the original medium, and the sociolinguistic niche, we've seen that Oghams at one end of the spectrum and that Pictish symbols are at the other end of the spectrum. And in fact, the only thing that they have in common is that the majority of the inscriptions that we have preserved for us today are lapidary. So all of these scripts were preserved in lapidary contexts, and so they seem to be, occurring in the same context, but I don't think originally they were. Of the answers that we had for the Pictish symbol script, we've seen that they're highly ornamentable, if not always ornamented in all contexts. They can fill a surface, and that they can conform to irregularities in the surface by means of rotation and reflection that I'd argue is not contrastive. Graphemes are identified the same from all perspectives, not just one, as in Ogham. And they're overtly associated with body ornament. So I'd argue that all of these observations are consistent with tattooing as a primary medium of use. So essentially, this is what we've seen today. So I've introduced Pictish symbols. I've surveyed what I imagine is the contrastive variation in the symbol system. I've compared with other writing systems to reveal a potential way that they functioned graphematically, as well as the grammatogenic scenario, so how the writing system was built with the same instructions as Ogham. And I've had a look at some of the visual properties of Ogham, Latin, and Pictish scripts to argue that Latin occupied this intellectual niche, Ogham a practical niche, and Pictish symbols an ornamental or potentially aesthetic niche. And these properties, I would argue, are all consistent with the historical sources that suggest tattooing was a primary medium of use for the symbol system. And I think that's the end.